Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero in for Elaine Quijano. Thank you for joining us. The Omicron variant of the coronavirus is causing concern for healthcare workers around the world. First detected in South Africa, the strain has now shown up in Australia, a handful of European countries, and Canada. On Monday, President Biden reassured Americans that health officials are on top of the new strain.
This variant is a cause for concern, not a cause for panic. We have the best vaccine in the world, the best medicines, the best scientists, and we're learning more every single day. And we'll fight this variant with scientific and knowledgeable actions and speed, not chaos and confusion.
In the meantime, the Senate is back in session with a number of pressing issues on the docket. Before Christmas, the upper chamber must pass the National Defense Authorization Act, approve government funding, raise the debt ceiling, and vote on President Biden's social and climate spending package. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says it will all get done in time for a holiday recess. But his party still remains at odds with Republicans on some issues and divided within on others. The House is not in session, but a feud between two lawmakers is heating up. Republican Congresswoman Lauren Boebert is under fire for making an Islamophobic remark about Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Boebert apologized publicly, but Omar said in a statement that Boebert refused to acknowledge in a call between the two of them the, quote, hurtful and dangerous comments. For more, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe, Eliza Collins, and Philip Bump. Ed is our CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Eliza is a politics reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Philip is a national correspondent for the Washington Post. Welcome to all of you. Ed, let me start with you. After the president gave an update about the Omicron COVID variant, you asked this of White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki in a briefing a little later. Let's listen.
The president insisted that the travel ban on South Africa doesn't punish them and neighboring countries, but South Africa's leaders say it does. How long does the White House envision that travel ban staying in place?
We will continue to assess it. I would say that the objective here is not to punish, it is to protect the American people. As you just heard the president say, this is not going to prevent, it is going to delay. And that delay is going to help us have necessary time to do the research by our health and medical teams, to get more people vaccinated and get more people boosted.
So, Ed, are other travel restrictions on the table?
She wouldn't say either way, and in fact made a point of saying that because there were so many cases tied to Omicron in southern Africa, that is why they decided to put that ban in place. But there were plenty of questions about, well, look, if there's cases coming out of Germany or Belgium or Israel, why not travel bans on those parts of the world? And as of now, at least, there are no plans to do that. They understand that this appears to have originated in southern Africa, that because it's going to take 10 days to 2 weeks to sort out what exactly this is, how lethal it might be, how dangerous it is, whether it's resistant to the vaccines that currently exist, that it makes sense for now, at least, to put a pause on travel, and wouldn't also say when exactly that travel ban might end.
Right. And Ed, of course, a particular concern for the White House and Americans is the potential economic impact of this new variant. What is being considered on that front?
That they are still trying to sort out exactly how it might affect inflation, the economic growth this quarter, supply chain concerns. Of course, this came on the same day that the president was meeting with a handful of retail CEOs from Walmart, Food Lion, Etsy, and other companies across the country who continue to assure him that they're going to have their shelves stocked, that Americans should be able to get what they're looking for, and if not, they're going to work to address those shortages. Sort of dual issues that this White House is facing right now. Obviously, they were hoping the pandemic would sort of become something that would settle itself over time through vaccination and boosting. Now, this urgent push to get people vaccinated and boosted to help fight off Omicron as we wait to see how serious it might be. Meanwhile, as you ticked off there at the top, he's got a host of things on the to-do list to work with Congress. Avoiding a government shutdown, the debt limit fight, passing the defense bill, and figuring out when or if exactly Build Back Better gets passed this year or whether that gets punted into next year, which of course is an election year. So it's a tough time right now for them to be doing this, which is why you've seen such an aggressive response by the White House in recent days. He's had 3 briefings on Omicron with his top medical advisors over 4 days. Lots of photos distributed, a lot of messaging put out saying he's on top of this, we're working on it, putting out medical advisors to talk to the media about it, all of it designed to suggest to the country and the world that this president's on top of it.
Right. And speaking of election year, as you brought it up, I mean, it's interesting because COVID has been one of those issues that that Americans have consistently given him high marks. But we've talked about the president and Democrats' attempts to rectify their weaker recent showing in elections. What can you tell us about what the White House is considering to bolster the party's position ahead of the midterms?
Well, we got a little taste of that today, Tanya, in the briefing again, where we saw the White House press secretary try to compare and contrast Democrats in charge of Congress and the White House right now with Republicans, who continue to insist that this White House isn't doing enough to fight inflation or the supply chain concerns. She points out, hey, that may be the case if you want to argue that, but where are your alternatives? What are you suggesting be done instead? And they argue that there's nothing being done, in essence, by Republicans, or nothing being proposed in a serious way about how to deal with these issues. And so I suspect that that is something we're going to hear more from her, from cabinet officials, and eventually perhaps the president. But he's not one to throw, sharp jabs, certainly this far from an election. While there may be Democrats in his orbit who say he's got to do that now to get his numbers back up and to help congressional Democrats, it'd be surprising to see him do that anytime soon. But to see that contrast between here's what Democrats are trying to do right now to address these issues, holding the meeting, for example, with CEOs today, talking about it again later this week, getting ready for another jobs report that could show a good uptick in hiring, even if there are still so many open jobs and people not necessarily looking for work or leaving their jobs. All of that designed to suggest action versus just criticism from Republicans and no real solutions. We'll see where that goes.
All right. Well, Ed, thank you so much. We know you have to run, so we will let you go. And Eliza, I'm going to turn to you now. As we mentioned earlier, the Senate's calendar is full until the end of the year. How do Democrats plan to get all this done in so little time?
Late nights and weekends. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has already warned that they should plan to be here in Washington for as long as it takes. They are really trying to get this Build Back Better package passed before the end of the year because, to Ed's point, next year is an election year, and it's much, much harder to pass something like this in an election year, especially when there are lots of vulnerable Democrats, especially in the House. But some of these things must pass or must be dealt with at least this month. Government funding runs out this week, so they'll have to figure out basically what it's looking more likely is that they'll push it off. Some Democrats say to do it just for later this month. Many lawmakers in both parties are saying, let's deal with it next year. The National Defense Authorization Act, which is basically funding for the military, and then, of course, the country's borrowing limit. So those things need to get done in December. Build Back Better is something they are choosing to do, but it's a huge part of Biden's agenda, and it's Democrats feel like they need to pass this in order to go into next year and have a shot at keeping both the House and Senate.
Right. And speaking of those borrowing limits, what is the latest on those debt ceiling negotiations between Minority Leader McConnell and Majority Leader Schumer?
So they are talking. This is different than a couple of months ago where Republicans were basically saying, we're not dealing with this. This is your debt. They're pointing to that Build Back Better package, along with some of Democrats' other spending earlier this year on coronavirus relief, saying, if you guys are adding to the deficit, then you need to be the ones to raise the debt limit. Of course, that's not exactly how it works. This is past debt that was actually approved under President Trump, but it's much easier when you're not in power to not have to do it. But they'll either need to pass it with 50 votes, which Democrats can do on their own, but Republicans can't filibuster it. So they can't require those 60 votes. So that's where they're negotiating. I think it's a lot harder for Republicans to hold this up as it gets closer to the holidays. People want to go home. Most Republicans would be just fine raising it, but it just takes one to hold it up. So I think Republicans are trying to figure that out, and we're seeing Schumer and McConnell at least negotiating, which is a better place than we were a couple of months ago.
Nothing like the motivation of the looming holiday season. All right, so Philip, you wrote that coronavirus posturing is the new Trumpism. What do you mean by that, and how could that play out with the spread of this new variant?
Well, the upshot is this. When we saw Donald Trump rise within the ranks of the Republican Party in 2015, it was really powered to a large extent by twin motivations. There was this anti-elitism strain. He represented an outsider to American politics. He was this businessman, so on and so forth. But he also was trying to empower his base to be able to stand up against the sort of oppressive society around them. Make America Great Again implies, going back to a time before things had changed in a way that people didn't like. And, that meant things like standing up against what is now called cancel culture, then he referred to as political correctness. We see the same sorts of things now at play with the coronavirus pandemic. We see this strain of anti-elitism, which is really crystallized around, for example, Anthony Fauci, the country's top infectious disease doctor, who on Face the Nation over this weekend was asked, "Are you being made a scapegoat?" He just sort of laughed and said, "Yes, I very much am." But at the same time, there is this undercurrent of people wanting to behave in a way that society is asking them not to do. That people are being asked to wear masks, people are being asked to be vaccinated, and people are sort of chafing against that in the same way that they were chafing against political correctness, and many still are. So, so it's the same sort of patterns that we're seeing as contributed to the rise of Donald Trump. And now we're seeing elected officials like Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida who are really leaning into that and seeing this as an opportunity to build political support outside of Donald Trump by using the same tactics that Trump once did.
Seems like it's sort of a "don't tell me what to do" stance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is very much, obviously that overlaps with this rejection of elitism that, I'm not going to listen to the doctors. I'm going to listen to, I'd much rather see what Tucker Carlson's saying about the vaccine than Anthony Fauci because I trust him more. There are all these ways in which that manifests. But yeah, I mean, this is being discussed in the context of personal freedoms, which is really, in a lot of ways, is sort of a cover for the fact that a lot of people just simply don't think the coronavirus is a big deal, don't want to be told what to do, don't want to have to wear a mask places, which of course no one's really excited about wearing a mask anywhere. But all of these things are sort of contextualized in this, I am a heroic patriot standing up against the Washington fascist elites, which is obviously wildly out of whack with the reality of what's happening, and helps contribute to the fact that vaccination rates still aren't where health experts would like them to be.
Right. And Eliza, I want to ask you about Republican Congresswoman Lauren Boebert's apology after implying her colleague, Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, was a possible suicide bomber. Where does that stand now? Was the apology accepted? Could Boebert face any further consequences in the House?
So exactly right. Last week, Congresswoman Boebert basically told a group of supporters a story that Congresswoman Omar says didn't happen. Basically, she says they were in an elevator and implied that Congresswoman Omar was a suicide bomber. Congresswoman Omar is one of the first two Muslim women to come to Congress. So Congresswoman Boebert today said that they did actually talk. She apologized publicly last week, but they connected today. No, it was not accepted. It did not go well. According to Boebert, she got on the phone. She apologized for basically what she said was making Muslims feel bad. It's not clear if she apologized actually to Congresswoman Omar. Congresswoman Omar said that that's not how it went, and that Congresswoman Boebert basically doubled down. The phone call ended with Congresswoman Omar hanging up and really calling on Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy to do something about Congresswoman Boebert. You asked if there will be repercussions. Well, Democrats control the House right now, and so Democrats can certainly do repercussions. We've seen it with two other Republican members who have basically gotten ahead and said very controversial things. Congresswoman Gosar just a couple of weeks ago tweeted a video of him killing Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, and the Democratic-led House censured him and removed him from his committees. So that's possible with Congresswoman Boebert, but it's unlikely we will see Republican leadership take action, which is what Democrats are calling on Kevin McCarthy to do.
But in the meantime, no love is lost between those two lawmakers. Philip, former President Trump released a statement calling for a televised debate over the 2020 election. What is the rationale behind that?
Well, I think there are a few rationales. One of them is that Donald Trump is very, very eager to get his bully pulpit back, to be back on television, to be seen as the center of attention within the Republican Party and national politics more broadly, to the point that I was just making about the coronavirus pandemic. But the other is that he continues to, anytime you are running, which I think it's very fair at this point, 1 year on, to say that this is something of a con that the president is engaged in. He's trying to con America into thinking that the 2020 election was stolen, which obviously it wasn't. But when you're running a con like that, you have to keep escalating the stakes. You have to keep saying, well, look, this is so serious that now I'm going to challenge to a televised debate, whoever's running the newspapers and so on and so forth, that you have to keep escalating the stakes. And so I think that part of it is that is an escalation of the stakes. But of course, there is no debate. There is no debate over what happened in 2020. There was no rampant fraud. You don't need to take my word for it. Simply go and look. There is no one who has been even accused credibly, much less arrested, for having participated in some broad scheme to throw the vote. It simply doesn't exist. And we spent a year, probably the most scrutinized election in American history. No one has been able to point to someone who's involved in this broad scheme. And so even as we're having this conversation about how Democrats are scrambling to try and figure out how to pass popular legislation, the implication is that somehow those same Democrats are able to keep a completely buttoned down massive illegal vote fraud scheme from coming to light. It defies credulity. And so Donald Trump, what he wants to do is he wants to just simply be on television and make these points that he's made any number of times that have all been debunked and have the audience to do that. I think it's extremely unlikely that any media outlet will grant him that platform, and I don't think any media outlet should.
All right. Well, Philip Bump and Eliza Collins, thanks to you both. We really appreciate you joining us.